Welcome to Science Proles, and today we are going to cover an article that was published in 2015 examining the potential of a DNA vaccine for the botulinum toxin. And now for this, you're going to need a little bit of background, and that's what the botulinum toxin does and how it works. What the botulinum toxin does is it causes paralysis, specifically flaccid paralysis. And what that means is it stops your neurons from talking to your muscles. Your neurons tell your muscles how to move or when to move using acetylcholine. And there's a sequence of proteins inside of your neurons that have to fire and work together in order to release acetylcholine, which is a chemical that your neurons release to tell your muscles that they need to move. So how does the botulinum toxin do this? Well, the botulinum toxin actually consists of two parts. One part, called the heavy chain, is responsible for making sure that the other part, the light chain, actually gets into the cell. The heavy chain binds to a receptor that's sticking out of one of your neurons where your muscles and your neurons meet. And once it binds to that protein, it helps sort of get the toxin into the neuron. And once the toxin is into the neuron, then the light chain, the smaller bit, can separate from the heavy chain and go, and it starts cutting in half all of the proteins that are responsible for making sure that your neuron releases acetylcholine to your muscle. And that's how the botulinum toxin causes paralysis. Basically, it stops your neurons from talking to your muscles at all. Another thing that you're going to need to know about the botulinum toxin is that the heavy chain comes in a bunch of different varieties. And those define the different types of botulinum toxin that there are. Only some of them can affect humans, and so those are going to be the ones that they focus on in the study. So the next thing that you're going to need to know is what the DNA vaccine is and how that works. The DNA vaccine really is just a plasmid, which is a circular segment of DNA that they make in a lab, and usually it codes for just a protein, and it's injected in your muscle, and then it causes some of your cells to start expressing that protein and producing that protein. And when that starts happening, it basically alerts your immune system to go off and find those cells and find what foreign protein that it's producing. And then as soon as it sees that foreign protein, your body starts producing antibodies for that particular protein. And the reason we want to do this is because once your body makes an antibody for one protein once, it typically remembers how to do that in the future. So whenever it sees that same protein again, it will know basically how to respond to it. So that's really how most vaccines work, but a DNA vaccine is really unique in the fact that it causes your own cells to produce these proteins. And in theory, it could be a little bit safer than other vaccines because you don't have to rely on potentially dangerous vectors to carry it. You don't have to actually produce the bacteria that releases the botulinum toxin. You don't have to rely on a virus to go in your cells. It's really your own cells producing it. And so in theory, it's a lot safer. At the same time, though, currently there's no DNA vaccine approved for humans yet by the FDA. And I want to emphasize that this is a really preliminary study that is an animal trial. And the reason why we're at that now is because DNA vaccines are still very new. And so the FDA is always wary about new things coming along, as they should be. And so it takes a bit longer for things like this to actually get passed through. So now that we understand what the botulinum toxin is, what it does, and what a DNA vaccine is, now we can start talking about the study. This study was really interesting. And what they did is they wanted to create 4 different vaccines. 3 targeting individual types of the botulinum toxin, and then 1 that could be used for all 3 of those different types of the botulinum toxin. Now, there are 7 types of the botulinum toxin, and it isn't covering all of those, but it is covering 3 of which are known. So these 4 types of vaccines were tried. 3 with an individual strain that they were targeting, and 1 that was targeting 3 different strains. And the way that they tried this out was they vaccinated these mice twice with each of these DNA vaccines. And then a few weeks later, they went in and measured the levels of antibodies to see whether or not the vaccine would actually produce a protective response. Now, researchers did find, in comparing the 3 vaccines that only targeted 1 strain of the toxin, that they all actually produced higher levels of antibodies than the 1 vaccine that was targeted to all 3 of them. And this could be important. However, When they moved on to the next part of the trial, where they actually injected the mice with the toxin, they found that all 4 of the different strains produced a 100% protective response. Now I want to go in detail into the vaccine that covered 3 strains of the toxin. For that, they actually broke down the 15 mice that were vaccinated into 3 groups of 5. Each group was injected with a different strain of the toxin because they wanted to make sure that the vaccine was actually effective against each of the 3 strains of toxin. And ultimately, they did find that it was 100% protective in these groups of mice. So this is an early trial and it's an animal trial, but it does indicate that this could be a decently effective vaccine. There are a few limitations, however. Because the researchers are doing this as an early phase trial, where they're just trying to determine whether or not the vaccine might be effective, they didn't really focus on any adverse effects. So we don't know whether or not this vaccine has negative side effects outside of its primary effect of protecting against the botulinum toxin. Additionally, it only used 1 animal model. Now, mice are a good model to study for the botulinum toxin, and usually there's a lot of carryover between what works for them and what works for us, but it's not necessarily a guarantee. So they should really follow this study up with a study examining the adverse effects and whether or not there are any, and then studying in another animal model to make sure that this does offer protection in humans. Now, unfortunately, the botulinum toxin is just too dangerous for us to try a vaccine in humans in any type of clinical trial. The most we could ever do is just a safety trial to make sure that there's no adverse effects in humans. We won't necessarily know whether or not it's 100% effective in humans until we actually have an emergency where we have to use it. So that's always one limitation to doing research into things like this, where you want to make sure that we're protecting against, something that could be potentially dangerous. So the good news is people don't get infected with botulinum toxin very frequently. But it is a risk in terms of, potential terror attacks and things like that. It's one of the things that people are concerned about. So we have to make sure that we are prepared. And so that's one of the reasons why performing this study is very important, because ultimately we don't have any vaccine today that works against the botulinum toxin. All we have is an antitoxin that we can administer after somebody's exposed. So hopefully researchers follow up on this study and can actually get this vaccine approved and prove that it actually works. But until then, we're just going to need to keep track of the research and see whether or not this vaccine does actually work. So thank you for tuning into Science Pearls. I hope you enjoyed the channel, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button below if you want to stay up to date on the latest science.